Hello, welcome to Gentle Wisdom Tales, where you find real-life stories that touch the heart.
The clock and the key. An old house, an old clock, and an old secret, and two people who will finally decide whether to lock it away or set it free. Frank and Helen Mercer had lived their lives by habit and by small certainties. They had married young and worked the same small-town jobs for decades. They had raised two sons, seen them go, and watched a town that once felt infinite narrow its streets into memory. Hawthorne House, a clapboard, slightly stooped residence on a quiet avenue, was more than a place to sleep. It was a ledger of hands and time. The house had a porch swing that creaked politely in the evenings, and an attic that kept the sun's slow dust. On the wall of the living room stood an old grandfather clock, its brass face worn dull where years of polishing had gone to reminders instead of shine. The clock kept time the way the town kept secrets, steady, unavoidable, and patient. When Daniel Reed, the family friend, neighbor, and retired town surveyor, fell ill, Frank and Helen went to the hospital like everyone else in the neighborhood, quietly, with casseroles and apologies. Daniel's mind had always been diplomatic. It arranged wills and deeds as if arranging violets on a table. He kept his life in papers and pencils and ledger lines. Even at the end, when his breath came in small, dry measures, he worried more about what he would leave behind than what he would take. He asked Frank and Helen to come to Hawthorne House one afternoon, with the gait of a man who had climbed a hill too often and decided only once to pause. "Keep the clock wound," Daniel said, and smiled with a mouth that had been used to signing his name, "and find the key." Frank and Helen did as he asked after his funeral. In the attic, beneath quilts and moving boxes, they found a wooden ladder, and above it the attic hatch. The hatch released with a reluctant sigh and a smell like old paper. Piled in a quiet corner were boxes tied with string, a faded suitcase, and a grandfather clock stored on its side, face covered with a sheet like a sleeping face. On top of the suitcase sat a neat envelope, inscribed in Daniel's shaky hand, "To my first son." Beneath the clock ran a thin seam in the woodwork. Frank, who had spent a life repairing gutters and tightening hinges, recognized it as the kind of clever joinery that disguised a hollow. He pulled at a small section, and out fell an old brass key on a string with a tag. Locker 118, Briar Glen Savings. Briar Glen Savings was the town bank. It had a green awning and white columns and the smell of coffee and coins in the morning. Locker 118 was a row of metal boxes inside a corridor of other people's pasts. The key fit with a click that felt like an answer. Inside the locker was a rusted tin, a small metal box, and a packet stamped evidence in red letters. On top of the packet lay a black and white photograph of a baby, chubby cheeks, a knitted cap, an apple held against its chest like a prop in a studio. On the back of the photograph, written by the same careful hand, was a single line, "For my first son." That night, Helen read aloud the confession Daniel had left in a sealed envelope. His handwriting was as methodical as his life, a tidy chronicle of an act he had done decades before to save a child. He wrote about a young woman he knew, Agnes, poor, frightened, and certain she could not feed a child into the world she knew. He wrote of promises to pay, of social workers who were persuaded, of men who signed blanks, and of the slow purchase of a future with silence. Daniel admitted that he had arranged for a child to be raised by another family and had paid for papers that changed the child's name. He explained it as protection, a father thinking he could buy mercy where the law offered exposure. He ended the letter with a confession that tasted like remorse. "I wanted to save what I loved. I did not think at the time that saving could mean stealing someone else's truth." They did not tell the other Reed sons that night. The family, like many others, organized grief into practicalities, calls to lawyers, the settling of small accounts, a candle at the bedside. But the photograph and the locker key sat on Helen's kitchen table, a new gravity in the middle of their daily lives. Both Frank and Helen felt, in the soft rustle of those papers, an obligation they had not asked for but would not refuse. To learn if the child in the photograph had lived a life who knew the truth, and if that life would be undone by the telling. Days turned to weeks. Frank and Helen drove to Briar Glen, an unassuming town with a bank whose interiors held the private lives of hundreds. Locker 118 contained exhibits of an old sin, property transfers with names erased and rewritten, receipts with wax seals, and a typed affidavit that had once been used to make a life official. There were deeds showing the passing of a small parcel of land, contracts for placement, and names that seemed to float like garments swapped on a line. The tiny box inside the locker contained a final envelope, sealed with red wax and addressed, carefully, "To all my children, Confession. They read the confession aloud at Daniel's bedside, with his breath softer than the rustle of paper. Daniel told, finally, the full story. Agnes had been a girl in a small town who came to him with a child in her arms and no money and fewer choices. He feared for her and feared for the child. He feared the townsmen who would call names and the men who would take advantage. He had purchased the child's future with money from his own account and his own shame. He had arranged for the child to be signed into the Whitaker family ledger, instructed the county clerk to allow the name change, and paid a social worker who wrote an affidavit that smoothed the transaction. When Daniel confessed, he said he had believed it was mercy. Only later did he see the truth of what he had done. When Daniel died, Frank and Helen took Daniel's papers and the photograph to their kitchen table and made a list. Names, dates, places. At the top of the list was Joseph Whitaker and the notation, "To my first son." They set the list aside and stared at the clock, which had begun to obstinately strike a new hour. The town had its own cycles. Revealing a secret was like setting a stone to roll down a hill. They could choose to tell, and so undo a life's names, or keep the secret and let the past sleep. They decided, with an old kind of courage, that they would tell. The unwrapping. When they approached Michael Whitaker with the documents, he was a man who had never expected his name to be questioned. The Whitaker family had farmed this land for 2 generations. Michael had married Rita Whitaker, taught Sunday school, and kept the town accounts with the stubborn pride of someone who trusted a name as a net. He was 70, steady, and kind. When Frank and Helen presented him the photograph and the bank envelope, his hands shook as if grasping for a truth that was both cold and warm at once. "You were raised by the Whitaker," Helen began softly, "but these papers suggest Daniel Reed purchased your placement as a child. He called you his first son." Michael's life folded at that sentence. The identity he had carried, the name in the ledger of the town, the stamps of his birth, seemed suddenly like a garment with someone else's scent sewn into the seams. He asked, as any man might, for time. He returned with the photograph sealed in the packet and the rusted tin that had once contained something Daniel had considered private. Frank and Helen watched as his hands turned the pages and his face learned how to read new history. There was anger, yes, but there was also a slow, aching gratitude that he had been given a family who loved him. Michael requested a meeting at the Reed house. The family gathered in that living room where once Daniel had signed and sealed with confidence. Outside, the town hovered like a theater audience awaiting the curtain's rise. Michael read Daniel's confession aloud, the sentences falling into the room like rain. In the long pause that followed, something shifted in the air between them, an unearthing that was more solemn than a scandal, and more tender than a revelation. The lawyer's counsels were practical. She advised on identity law, on the rights of a man who had lived and worked under one name for 70 years, on the possible upheaval of property titles, and the harm that could be done to the Whitaker lineage if the matter were mishandled. She said often, with the weary clarity of a field medic, that the law protected lives as they were lived, not merely as they had been authored on paper. Helen, who had always kept accounts, understood this. She argued for a careful public presentation, the family first, then the town. They met at the small Methodist church in Briar Glen with a handful of witnesses and a congregation that said it did not want gossip, only truth. Frank and Helen presented the evidence and read Daniel's confession aloud. Michael spoke afterwards. He did not ask for reparation with fists raised and lawyers in hand. He simply said, "I am who raised me, made me, and who I was meant to be. I will not be less of either." In his voice, the town heard something steadier than scandal, the hum of a life that wanted only to be acknowledged rather than erased. But the world is a thin sheet, and when you lift one corner, you reveal what lies beneath. The truth spread, and with it came complications. People who had signed deeds decades ago were suddenly asked to explain margins and ink stamps. Property transfers were reviewed. Families who had benefited from Daniel's payments found themselves in awkward light. The county opened an inquiry. There were legal motions and claims, and lawyers relished paper like miners relish ore. At Daniel's funeral, Frank and Helen stood beside the little tin and the photograph. Michael, who chose to be present but not to demand retribution, kept a measured distance. He put his hand on the little tin, as if blessing both the object and the life it had concealed. He asked that the town acknowledge what had been done without trying to unmake the stitches that had held so many lives in place. There were, inevitably, those who resented the revelation, whose pensions and titles now rested on margins. There were also those who thanked the Mercers for telling the truth. Winter came in slow white, and the town adjusted. Locker 118 was retired, not in forgetfulness, but in remembrance. The bank placed a small plaque about transparency in the entrance hall. The county assigned a clerk to help those whose names had been shuffled to find anchors in their records. Michael requested and was given a small plaque beside Daniel's grave. It read, simply, "Choices," and then something unexpected. Helen discovered in the clock's hidden compartment a small sealed envelope with Daniel's handwriting. "If I have done wrong, I have done it thinking I served mercy. If mercy requires theft, then call it what it is. The letter had a final request: to be known, not to be forgiven without reckoning. Helen and Frank took it to Michael. The men and women in the town who had been affected were invited to a meeting, an offering of the truth, and an appeal to do something small and patient, to make reparations where possible, to restore titles where negligence had been proven, and to begin, publicly, to say names. For a while it seemed the community might accept the proposition that truth could be a kind of slow medicine. Small acts of repair were made, a field title restored to a family, a registry opened for those seeking missing birth records, funds distributed where evidence of paid-for placements existed. People unearthed memories, a photograph here, a receipt there, and the town's ledger trembled under the touch of daylight. Yet human lives are not spreadsheets. There were relational repairs that money could not buy. Michael's son, for instance, a younger man named Andrew who had lived with the Whitaker name and all that came with it, now carried an ache for identity that had nothing to do with titles. Andrew had been raised to believe his life fit a neat script. When he learned the script had been redrafted by a man he had admired, the impression was not of betrayal, but of a small world reordered with a new center of gravity. Andrew, his brother Caleb, and other younger family members attended meetings and stood in doorways, unsure whether to step into the quiet that truth had made. At the center of all this, Daniel's confession functioned like a clock that had been wound too tight. It moved the hands, stopped the pendulum, and then let time settle into a new rhythm. Frank and Helen carried on with petitions and phone calls, and the daily work that opens files and makes calendars. Yet in the quiet of their kitchen, in the sound of the clock's tick, they felt a worry. Telling had not made everything right. It had opened more questions than it could answer. It had taught them that truth, once released, did not always heal. Sometimes it made the wound visible and asked the town to do the work of tending it. On a cold morning thick with frost, as the funeral and the repairs became memory and procedure, Frank returned to the attic to retrieve a ledger he had forgotten. Sunlight shifted. Dust motes performed a slow ballet in the attic's window. Frank's hands brushed against the clock's underside, the very panel that Daniel had used to hide his key. The panel gave way easily, as if it had been waiting. Frank found, tucked behind the clock's wooden heart, a slim stack of papers he had not seen before: photographs, a small bundle of letters, and a typed note on an official letterhead that stopped his breathing. The note was not by Daniel. It was from the county clerk 60 years before, written in a neat formal hand that said, in essence, "This office accepts the affidavit and certifies the modification of birth record for purpose stated." The clerk's signature was followed by a second name: Chief Registrator, Whitaker. Frank stared at the signature. It was the Whitaker name. He had always thought that the Whitaker family had been the passive recipients of Daniel's arrangement. The new papers suggested otherwise. There were receipts with the Whitaker family name stamped on bank letterhead. There were ledgers in Frank's hands showing payments, not only from Daniel, but also from a Whitaker account, payments labeled as expenses for placement. When he showed the papers to Helen, a map redrew itself under their feet. The Whitaker had not been a single family thrown together by the mercy of one man. They had been, it appeared, an institution of their own, with the authority to help or to profit from decisions about children. The Whitaker name was entangled with another thread, that of men who traded in the currency of adoption and influence. The twist seared like frost on an old bruise. Daniel had not been the only architect. The Whitakers had not been only recipients. Frank and Helen, with the new papers, faced a moral hazard deeper than they had anticipated. The town's neat story: Daniel bought a life to save it, now had a shadow. The Whitakers had collaborated, perhaps even required payment, perhaps even benefited materially. When the Mercers presented this new evidence at the next town meeting, shock rolled through the congregation like wind over water. There was in the gathering a sound like a clock unlatched, disbelief, anger, and the soft helpless thudding of grief. Michael Whitaker's reaction was a study of a man compressed. He had wanted a life in which love had been straightforward. The paper unmasked a different truth. The Whitaker name had been used, whether knowingly or not, to secure church favors and municipal credence. Where Michael had expected to find absolution in the narrative that Daniel had been the single guardian of a child's fate, he now found the complicity of his own family. He felt betrayed, not just by Daniel, but by a heritage he had trusted. The revelation set off a cascade of consequences. The county reopened every file bearing the Whitaker name, and with each opened folder, more names and more receipts emerged. The Whitaker patriarchs had not only accepted payment, they had signed affidavits and arranged placements as a kind of private philanthropy that blurred ethical lines. Some whispered that in doing so they protected children. Others said they protected their own standing. The town, which had rallied around choices and repairs, now stumbled into the murkier territory of institutional accountability. The climax did not erupt in a single shout. It arrived as a series of procedural changes. The bank suspended certain accounts pending review. The county appointed an investigative committee. The church excommunicated a man whose descendants had been tied to the Whitaker decisions. Families learned that their names were not merely titles but instruments in a structure that had once pretended to be kind. Then, in a meeting fraught with the electric silence of history's unspooling, Michael Whitaker stood and said something nobody expected. "I will not let my family's name be a reason any child loses their right to truth," he announced. His voice was ragged with the work of ownership. "I did what I thought was right as a young man. If that involved choices I can no longer endorse, then let the record show I will help repair it." He volunteered the Whitaker estate's records, surrendered sealed boxes from locked rooms, and promised restitution where the county found wrong. He asked the town, the families, and the church to judge both deeds and intentions, but he asked, above all, to be part of the repair. That act reframed the climax. The twist, that the Whitaker name had not been merely a passive beneficiary, could have become a cudgel. Instead, Michael used it as a lever, not to absolve himself or to punish his forebears, but to force a larger repair. The once neat story, Daniel as lone confessor, the Mercers as truth-tellers, Michael as revealed son, became a more complicated mural. People found themselves at a fork, revenge or repair. Michael chose repair. He stood between a town and its ledger, offering the Whitaker resources to fund truth and reconciliation. The change was not instant. It was not peaceful. Families sued, argued, and made claims. But the town also created a registry where people could file to have their names restored or annotated, an archive where children could find their birth names if they so wished, and a fund to help with counseling. The bank donated the little tin to a historical society. Locker 118 became a small exhibit at the town library, with a plaque that read, "When mercy becomes secrecy, the price is greater than we imagine." Accounting for time. Even after the fires of revelation had cooled, the work of repair continued as an old man mending a fence. Patient, repetitive, sometimes unseen. Frank and Helen aged a little more in those months. Their hair silvered, and their hands kept the marks of more conversations than they had thought possible. They went to meetings, answered questions, and sat with families whose lives had been rerouted by decisions made long ago. Michael Whitaker, who had at once been exposed and then chosen transparency, began to compose something that resembled a public life of apology and service. He spoke at the town meeting and asked for humility rather than pardon. He funded a genealogy project and underwrote the cost of legal name restorations for those who wished it. He sat with young parents, and with older men who still used the Whitaker name, with pride, and invited them to tell what they felt. The town did not always forgive. The ledger of relations had incurred losses not easily wiped away. Some people left the town. Others stayed and found that living with an acknowledged wrong required the daily courage of ordinary things: baking pies at church bazaars, keeping the books at the local co-op, watering roses that would bloom iridescent on a spring morning. Frank and Helen learned to accept that telling the truth had not healed everything. But it had, in many small instances, prevented more stealthy thefts of life. Children found birth names in record boxes. One man tracked down a mother who had thought herself anonymous and took her hand on a bench at the bank. The Whitaker family hosted public hearings. The bank issued new policies. The county clerk worked overtime to repair records. The little plaque at the cemetery now read, in neat script, "Choices, confession, repair." Years on, Michael's decision to stand with the town rather than run from it became, in its own small way, the town's test. He attended hearings, answered for his family, and sometimes sat silently in the back of church while others spoke. He came to the Reed house and sat with Frank and Helen by the clock, the very instrument that had once hidden a key. He took Daniel's envelope that had been read aloud, and laid a wreath where Daniel lay, not in judgment but in a curious compassion for a man who had believed himself merciful. Frank and Helen, who had started as keepers of a house and small account, found they had become keepers of a different kind of ledger. They maintained boxes not of secrets but of records. They recorded apologies and lists of restitution made. They made a file for each family that had been affected. When strangers asked why they had told, Helen would smile in that way that people use to hold both patience and truth, and say, because a life deserves to know its name. The town learned to be less certain of its inherited stories. It taught the children, at school events and in Sunday sermons, that the oldest kindnesses are not those kept in envelopes but those spoken in daylight. Hawthorne House kept its clock wound. The grandfather clock ticked in the attic, its face polished, its secret compartment open and empty. The rusted tin sat in the library, a lesson for the next generation about the cost of secret protections. In the end, the Mercers stood at the gate of Hawthorne House on a mild late afternoon and watched Michael Whitaker's grandson, a boy with a face suggestive of both families, lift the photograph of the baby and smile at it as if at a compass. They had done the work to let the child choose his map. Helen kept one scrap of paper in her purse until the day she died, a single line Daniel had written long ago, and later regretted. "I wanted to save what I loved, but I learned, to my shame, that some savings are theft." At her funeral they read that line aloud and set it like a coin on the grave. The reading held the town's breath. It made a small, stern kind of peace. Frank and Helen moved at last into a quieter rhythm. They came to the town's registry sometimes to answer questions, often to sit in the back during hearings, and see the faces of those who had reclaimed names. They wound the clock on the kitchen wall and let it say, with its steady chime, that time keeps both reckoning and cure. They had broken a long habit of secrecy, and paid, in kind, the costs of repair, awkward conversations, legal filings, and neighbors who still resented being asked to choose between truth and comfort. The final act of their long stewardship came in a churchyard, where Michael Whitaker's family, and the Reed descendants, and a town that had learned to be honest with itself gathered. Frank and Helen stood in the slow sun. Michael took the baby photograph and placed it on a small stand. He spoke not of heroism, but of responsibility. He asked the town to keep the registry open, the archives accessible, and the little tin at the library, as a reminder. Then he turned and thanked Frank and Helen for their courage. The crowd dispersed with a certain tenderness. The town did not become a different place overnight. New arguments would rise. New secrets might tempt old hands. But the habit of telling, once taught and practiced, made a new kind of citizenry, one that understood that a good intention kept in darkness can rot. A confession, however late, can still be the seed of repair. Moral of the story: truth may hurt at first, but it's the only thing that can truly heal, because hidden mercy can quietly steal identity and peace for years. This story reminds us that good intentions don't cancel wrong choices. Real kindness is having the courage to reveal, take responsibility, and repair what secrecy damaged. The end.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more real-life stories.